You can get going.
You're going to count me in?
Yeah.
Okay.
And we're live.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 David Neufeld Memorial Lecture. My name is Jonathan Ludi, and I'm a postdoc in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at the University of Toronto. And I'm also one of the co-conveners of the annual David Neufeld Memorial Lecture. Throughout my doctoral studies in the Yukon and Alaska, David was a true mentor. He welcomed me into his home and his community. And he was a constant source of sound advice, scholarly inspiration, and well-timed good humor. One of the most important pieces of advice that David passed on was about the importance of getting out of the archives and connecting with the people, communities, and the landscapes that we, as Northern and environmental historians, are so interested in. Today, I have the great pleasure of opening the 2022 Neufeld Lecture and introducing this year's speaker, Professor Cody Groat. Before opening the lecture, however, I'd like to make a territorial acknowledgement and encourage all members of the audience to reflect on their responsibilities to the traditional territories from which they are joining the meeting today. Today, I'm joining you from Ilamastukwek, which is the Bay of Islands on the west coast of the island of Udamgook, or Newfoundland. I respectfully acknowledge the land on which I am situated as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk. I also acknowledge the island of Udamgook as the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and Mi'kmaq peoples. I acknowledge Labrador as the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Innu of Nitassinan, the Inuit of Nunatsiavut, and the Inuit of Nunatuqavut. As many of the people in the audience will know, David was a historian who championed many things, including Northern history, public history, and Indigenous history and heritage. He spent his career as a Parks Canada historian learning from the people in the land of the Yukon, advocating for inclusion and two-eyed seeing, and mentoring young and early career researchers who shared his passions. David's passing in late 2020 brought to light just how many people, both within and outside the academic community, he had influenced, supported, and mentored throughout his life and his career. To honor his legacy, a group of his friends, family, colleagues, and mentees established the Neufeld Memorial Lecture, an annual lecture that will feature the work of early career researchers, public historians, and heritage workers. In keeping with the spirit of David's work and his commitments, this event will remain free and open to the public and housed online for future viewing. As one of the conveners of the lecture series, I can say with great confidence that David would have been absolutely thrilled and excited to hear Professor Groat speak today. Cody Groat is an assistant professor in the Department of History and Indigenous Studies, the Indigenous Studies program at Western University in London, Ontario. He is Ganyan Kahaga and a band member of the Six Nations of the Grand River. His PhD explores the federal commemoration of Indigenous histories by the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada. Cody earned an MA in World Heritage Studies from the University of Birmingham in the UK through the Iron Bridge International Institute for Cultural Heritage. He serves as the chair of the Canadian Commission for UNESCO the Commission for UNESCO Memory of the World Advisory Committee, and is president of the Indigenous Heritage Circle, a national not-for-profit dedicated to the advancement of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis cultural heritage priorities. Today, Cody will be speaking on cultural landscapes, the climate crisis, and the commemoration of Indigenous cultural heritage. So with that, I will invite Cody to take the virtual stage and bring to us the 2022 David Neufeld Memorial Lecture. Thank you, Cody.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I appreciate that warm invitation. I'm going to try to share my screen. I'm very technology illiterate, and I hope everyone can see it. Jonathan, maybe if you could turn on your camera for a second and just give me a thumbs up. Perfect. Okay, thank you, everyone. And again, I really do appreciate this invitation to give the 2022 David Neufeld Memorial Lecture on cultural landscapes and the climate crisis, commemorating Indigenous cultural heritage. As Jonathan mentioned, my name is Cody Groat. I am from Western University in London, Ontario. I'm in the History Department and the Indigenous Studies program. And while I was preparing this lecture, I actually learned that David Neufeld himself is a graduate from the Western University History program. He earned an MA here. So it's great to have that connection as well as part of this lecture. Now, again, there was no sort of obligation to situate this presentation within David Neufeld's work, but it was sort of natural for me to do so because a lot of my research that I've done so far has really built off some of the important work that he's done as an academic, as a heritage practitioner. One of the courses I'm teaching this semester for fourth year students is called Indigenous Peoples in Public History. And it was very natural for me to start our very first class with an article that was written by David. So last week we discussed his article called Ethics in the Practice of Public History with Aboriginal Communities. And his article notes that public history is a culturally entrenched social tool. Assumptions of a truth are culturally centered. And in the practice of history, when we talk about scholarly monographs, articles, we sort of know this now. This is sort of in our minds that history is written from a certain perspective. We have these inherent biases. But that same criticism hasn't necessarily been levied at public history, especially something as broad as a cultural landscape that's recognized by the federal government or by the international community. And David had developed 3 basic principles for working with Indigenous nations. And I feel like all of those are relevant to the work that I do, but also what I'm trying to teach to my students and some of the lessons that we can get from this lecture today. David mentioned that it's necessary to recognize an alternative cultural context for the analysis of the past and identity. People don't view the past the same way. There are so many distinct Indigenous nations in Canada, and the way that they view the past and their relationship to it and how their traditional territory plays a part in that is so vastly different from the perspectives that he had as a Parks Canada employee, that I have as a Ganagahaga citizen. Again, we have to incorporate that into all we do as public historians. We have to realize that there's a power and difference between the researcher and these Indigenous nations and communities. And again, if we don't recognize that going in, we can be as collaborative as we want going into these projects, but there always is going to be that inherent power balance that needs to be recognized and called to attention. Also, he noted that there has to be advocacy for change in the professional discourse of public historians. And again, I think that hopefully this lecture can advocate for some form of professional change in the field. And again, with one of the most pressing issues that's affecting us today, which is the climate crisis. Now, interestingly, my research touches on the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada, their commemoration of Indigenous cultural heritage. And David Neufeld was appointed to the Historic Sites and Monuments Board in June 2019, the 100th anniversary of the Historic Sites and Monuments Board, which was established in 1919 to provide expert advice to the Government of Canada on the commemoration of national historic sites, national historic people, and national historic events. Now, in 1919, the Historic Sites and Monuments Board approved a definition that they used for something called Aboriginal cultural landscapes, developed by a Parks Canada historian named Susan Buggy in consultation with a lot of other Parks Canada employees. Now, they define Aboriginal cultural landscapes as a place valued by an Aboriginal group because of their long and complex relationship with that land. It expresses their unity with the natural and the spiritual environment. It embodies their traditional knowledge of spirits, places, land uses, ecology. Material remains may be prominent, but they'll often be minimal or absent. So as I try to tell my students, the most important thing to take away about what an Indigenous cultural landscape is that relationship between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. That holistic relationship is what is significant and what's celebrated and ideally preserved and protected. Now, given its mandate, the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada only kind of recognizes Aboriginal cultural landscapes if they are nationally important aspect of Canadian history. They do have that very nationalist lens. So there are some Indigenous cultural landscapes that are vitally significant to Indigenous nations that aren't recognized through this designation of national historic sites because either they don't meet that threshold of being nationally significant, or alternatively, Indigenous nations just don't see the value or benefit of them being commemorated by the Historic Sites and Monuments Board. Some nations don't want that colonial label of National Historic Site of Canada because it doesn't represent to them the significance of their land and their territory as they know it within their own national context. Now, I apologize for this very text-heavy slide. The next one is also text-heavy, but then we'll move on to some pictures. So Canada has its own domestic national definition of cultural landscapes, but I also look closely at the World Heritage Convention, developed by UNESCO, or the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Office, in 1972. It's celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. This is actually one of the most universally accepted international agreements in the entire world, obviously. And again, it's one of the most significant heritage conventions ever established. The World Heritage Convention seeks to preserve significant cultural and natural sites on the World Heritage List. Now, this is not a legally binding document, and in fact, it says the overarching benefit of ratifying or signing the World Heritage Convention is just that these sites will belong to an international community of appreciation and concern for universally significant properties. Until 1992, there was this deep divide between cultural and natural sites, and we still see that in Canada. We're slowly working away from it, but even within the kind of the label of Parks Canada, which David Neufeld was associated with, we have national parks, we have national historic sites, and again, there's still this divide between the cultural and natural significance of some historic sites. But as of 1992, UNESCO started recognizing mixed sites, which we can kind of refer to as cultural landscapes, valuing both the cultural and natural significance of an area. Mechthild Rossler, the former director of the UNESCO World Heritage Center, has written that cultural landscapes are at the interface between nature and culture. They represent a close woven set of relationships. They are a symbol of a growing recognition of the fundamental links between communities and their heritage, humankind, and the natural environment. Now, what's important for us moving forward in this lecture is that Rossler describes a whole bunch of cultural landscapes that we can perceive. She uses the term culturally defined landscapes designed and created intentionally. Well, that's a huge mouthful, but essentially these are non-Indigenous examples of cultural landscapes, like Royal Botanical Gardens, the Rideau Canal, Mount Pleasant Cemetery, some of these very well-known sites, which are, again, deeply associated with relationships between humans and the natural environments, but they're sort of these surface level associations, in my opinion. She also notes associative cultural landscapes. And to me, these are the kind of cultural landscapes that we will be discussing today. Those that are sort of based on this deeply significant holistic relationship. Indigenous nations are so deeply associated with their traditional territories that they recognize themselves, we recognize ourselves as being inherently part of that landscape. So again, this is our last very text-heavy slide, so I apologize. We have the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada. We have the World Heritage Convention. And both of these recognize cultural landscape as being significant, these vast areas where Indigenous nations have a holistic relationship with their traditional territories. But we also have other things. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, treaty rights. So the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, was accepted by the international community in 2007. In 2021, last year, Canada passed a law to assure that its other legislation was consistent with UNDRIP, which is a very kind of loose, non-binding statement. UNDRIP Article 11 says that Indigenous peoples have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and their customs. This includes the right to maintain, protect, and develop the past, present, and future manifestations of their cultures, such as archaeological and historic sites. Article 25 says that Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with the traditionally owned or other occupied and used lands, territories, waters, and coastal seas. So because Canada has passed the UNDRIP Act, it has to make sure that all federal laws are consistent with these rights that we have. They don't have to assure that they necessarily happen, but they also have to assure that no other laws explicitly deny Indigenous peoples these rights. Canada has also adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goal 13 says that the country should take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. And we'll get to this shortly, but Indigenous peoples have lived holistically and sustainably on these lands for tens of thousands of years. We've done this in a way that can help combat the climate change crisis by recognizing some of our deeply inherent heritage values that we associate with these landscapes. There's also treaty rights we have to recognize. So this is an excerpt from the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nations Final Agreement. There's 14 self-governing First Nations in the Yukon. All of them have treaty relationships with Canada, and all of those treaties have specific provisions regarding the preservation of cultural heritage. Section 13.1.1.3 says that there is an inherent treaty right to involve equitably Yukon First Nations in government and the management of heritage resources of the Yukon, consistent with a respect for Yukon Indian values and culture. Our relationship to the environment, our relationship to the traditional territory is not just some heritage statement that's said there and doesn't have any sort of backing. There is, the actions of the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada. There's the World Heritage Convention. There's UNDRIP. There's the UNDRIP Act. There's Sustainable Development Goals. There are treaty rights. And again, treaty rights, including these heritage provisions, are guaranteed within Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This treaty right, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, supersedes UNDRIP, supersedes any of these national or international agreements, legislation, conventions, etc. Our relationship with our traditional territories is guaranteed as a heritage right through the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, most notably in the Yukon through these very explicit heritage provisions in their treaties. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to really focus on this World Heritage Convention and some of these cultural landscapes and how our relationship to our traditional territories has now been viewed as internationally significant. To be designated as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO, a site has to have something called outstanding universal value. Now, there's a lot of flaws with this because it tries to quantify heritage, makes it a checkbox, we're meeting this specific obligation. There's a lot of different aspects of outstanding universal value. For example, a site could represent a masterpiece of human creative genius. And that's how the Statue of Liberty was designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. A site could bear a unique or at least exceptional testimony to a cultural tradition or to a civilization which is living or which has disappeared. And that's how the pyramids of Giza were designated a World Heritage Site. A site could be directly or tangibly associated with events or living traditions, with ideas or with beliefs of outstanding universal significance. And that's how Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp in Poland was commemorated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, very controversially. And again, highlighting natural values, a site could contain superlative natural phenomenon or areas of exceptional natural beauty. And that's how the Great Barrier Reef was commemorated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So let's look at these Canadian examples. And again, this nature-culture divide was so inherent, so deeply ingrained in the World Heritage Convention for many years that a site could either be commemorated for natural values or for cultural values until 1992. There was no overlap between the two of them. The Canadian Rocky Mountains was one of the first UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Canada. And it was commemorated for the following reason. The 7 parks of the Canadian Rockies form a striking mountain landscape with rugged mountain peaks, ice fields, glaciers, alpine meadows, lakes, waterfalls, extensive karst cave systems, thermal springs, deeply incised canyons. The Canadian Rocky Mountain Parks possess exceptional natural beauty, attracting millions of visitors annually. So there's some sort of human reference to that, some form of cultural significance. But again, it's just talking about the exceptional natural beauty. Now, the problem with this is that it erases the lived experience and the holistic relationship between the Rocky Mountains and the Piikani, Siksika, Kainai, Atsina, Tsuut'ina, Nakota, and Niueak people who have occupied this region since time immemorial. They are completely erased from the significance of the site. And that has significant implications for these Indigenous nations. Because under the World Heritage Convention, Parks Canada, as the agency that oversees this site, has an obligation to assure that the outstanding universal value of this place remains whole and remains present. So again, if the outstanding universal value of this place is only that it's naturally significant, that has these exceptional alpine meadows and mountain peaks, that's what Parks Canada has to maintain. So this reductionist interpretation of natural history, where it only focuses on these natural values, has a significant impact on the lives of Indigenous nations within their own traditional territory. They're almost, by the World Heritage Convention, excluded from this traditional territory. Now, there's other examples. Pomochanaq is a World Heritage Site on the Ontario-Manitoba border. It was Canada's first cultural landscape commemorated as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. And the reason why it was commemorated is because Pomochanaq is directly and tangibly associated with the living tradition and beliefs of the Anishinaabe, who understand that they were placed on the land by the Creator and given all they need to survive. They are bound to the land and to caring for it through a sacred responsibility to maintain their cultural tradition of Ji Ganawandbang Gedigaman, or keeping the land. This involves ceremonies at specific sites to communicate with other beings, and respect for sacred places such as pictograph sites, thunderbird nests, places where Mimigasawag or Little Rock people dwell, in order to ensure harmonious relations with the other spirit beings with whom Anishinaabe share the land and maintain a productive life on the land. And again, this is the criteria why the international community, almost every country in the world, agreed that this landscape is significant. There was international agreement that Pomochanaq is internationally worth preserving because of the relationship between the Anishinaabe and their traditional territory, because of their holistic relationship, because of their sacred responsibility to maintain this environment as they've done since time immemorial. That contrasts so significantly with the Canadian Rocky Mountains parks. So while Parks Canada has an obligation to sort of maintain the natural significance of this territory, they don't necessarily need to focus on the lived experiences of Indigenous nations. For Pomochanaq, there is this requirement. Canada has signed an international agreement in which they have agreed to maintain the relationship between the Anishinaabe and their traditional territory. And the international community is now going to monitor to assure that this criteria is being respected, to assure that the outstanding universal value is in place. And again, that is relationship between the Anishinaabe and their natural environment. If that's damaged, if that's threatened in any way, then the heritage value of this place is then considered lost to the international community. And it's actually really firm, these obligations to maintain. There's no kind of legal compliance, but a notable example just last year is Liverpool in England. It was highly regarded as a World Heritage Site, as a maritime capital. So a lot of ships went in and out of that port for centuries. It was kind of a vital hub. And a lot of development was taking place on the former marina. They were adding new skyscrapers, for instance, which threatened the heritage value of the docks. And after consistent complaints by UNESCO about these developments and how they were threatening the heritage value, that site was revoked as a World Heritage Site, and now it's delisted permanently. And that sort of had a lot of international pushback by communities. So the international community is willing to pull the status of this if that relationship, that outstanding universal value, is threatened. Now, to become a UNESCO World Heritage Site, you have to be added to something called the tentative list. Every approximately 10 years, countries update their tentative list. Canada did so in 2018. And these are sites that in the next few years, Canada plans on nominating as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Now, this system is so deeply flawed, in my opinion, for a few reasons. It takes approximately 10 years to become a World Heritage Site, and it costs about $500,000 if you're lucky to go through the process of writing nomination dossiers, having the site critically evaluated, PR campaigns associated with this. A lot of Indigenous nations can't afford to go through that process. So there's actually a very significant overrepresentation of World Heritage Sites in Canada that are operated, stewarded by Parks Canada because they have the economic means. They're actually also the federal organization in Canada that's responsible for adopting and utilizing the World Heritage Convention. And I know a lot of people from Parks Canada are part of this conference today, so I apologize for sort of that call out. But this is a site on Canada's tentative list, the Stein Valley Nalek Heritage Park in British Columbia. And this is its proposed outstanding universal value. This is why they think that this should be designated as a World Heritage Site. The rich environment of this valley has sustained and nurtured Nalek for millennia. providing them with many of their traditional foods, medicines, and materials. Most important, the Stein Valley embodies the sacred aspects of Nalakpamuk life, a place where Nalakpamuk go to gain knowledge and spiritual power. Tangible evidence of this sacred nature lies in the many well-preserved pictographs found on cliffs and boulders along the ancient trail, revealing sacred places where spiritual powers are gained through visions and rituals. A wealth of Nalakpamuk traditional knowledge in the forms of creation stories, oral histories, ethnobotany, are a testament to the intangible attributes that embody the significance of the landscape. Numerous named places tell of long ago events, including transformers and their ancestors, and the valley still represents with Ha, or sacred powers. But Nalakpamuk continue to use, maintain, and protect this vital cultural landscape. It remains their most sacred place for teaching traditions and for gaining spiritual knowledge. So like Pomochanaq, counter to the Rocky Mountains, the international significance of this site isn't its natural values, isn't its cultural values, it's the deep and holistic relationship between people and the landscape. Here's another example from Canada's UNESCO World Heritage tentative list. Again, it was added in 2018. The Yukon Ice Patches. They were nominated by the Karkrosh Tagish First Nation and the Yukon government. Now, its proposed outstanding universal value, the reasons why this site is deemed so significant is because of two things. One, the serial components of the Yukon Ice Patches have produced a unique collection of ancient and well-preserved hunting implements that provide exceptional evidence for an enduring Indigenous cultural tradition of seasonal hunting throughout the Holocene epoch. The systematic radiocarbon dating of these artifacts supports that the ice patches were used consistently and without disruption or cultural discontinuity for at least 7,500 years. So again, we see this deep cultural relationship to this site, but this next value, criteria 5, is again part of this holistic relationship with Indigenous peoples in the natural environment. And it says, Yukon ice patches are a rare and distinctive landscape phenomenon that developed through the intersection of mesoclimatic conditions and critical mountain caribou and thin-horned sheep habitat. The coalescence of qualities combined with evidence of persistent seasonal hunting demonstrates an outstanding and enduring use of a cultural landscape centered on alpine hunting. And to me, most importantly, it evolved based on symbiotic relationships between ice, animals, insects, and people for 7,500 years. The international value of this site is that holistic relationship between animals, insects, humans, and the ice itself. That is a vital part of this relationship. So this is where we get to the climate change portion of this presentation. We've noted many times that the international significance of Indigenous relationships to their territories are so rooted in our culture. These are preserved through various pieces of legislation, recognized through many things. But we see these headlines day after day. They're becoming more and more common. Ontario forest fires burned record area of land this summer as they displaced First Nations in the Northwest. This is Pomochanaq World Heritage Site. If it's internationally recognized that this landscape is significant because of the Indigenous relationship to this territory, the Indigenous stewardship of this territory, we need to recognize that the climate crisis is inherently destroying that relationship. Here's another headline. 80% of mountain glaciers in Alberta, BC, and Yukon will disappear within 50 years. It's internationally recognized that the significance of this landscape is the relationship between Indigenous nations and the ice, that symbiotic, holistic relationship. So if this climate crisis continues as it is, that relationship that's internationally recognized as being significant is being damaged to the point where it might be permanently lost. So these are my takeaways. And you know, I'm a bit ahead of schedule because I'm a fast talker, but hopefully that means a lot of questions. Now, David Neufeld argued that public historians working alongside Indigenous communities had to advocate for change. So this is what this presentation is. It's a call for change within the field of heritage practitionership within public history, within the stewardship of traditional territories. It has been recognized that the holistic relationship between Indigenous nations and their traditional territories are nationally and internationally significant. These relationships are part of our heritage. They're protected through treaty rights, through the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The climate crisis impacts Indigenous cultural heritage, which is nationally and internationally recognized and protected. So we can say with affirmity that this is a violation of our treaty rights as Indigenous peoples. If we have rights to preserve our heritage, if our heritage is being destroyed by the climate crisis, inability to address the climate crisis is a violation of our treaty rights. So again, my big takeaway here is environmental history, which is sort of the core of this organization, has legal implications. And I think that's worth it for us to consider, and we can advocate for change to recognize that this is being addressed as it needs to be. And I think with that, Jonathan, I'll pass the floor back to you and to Heather.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cody. I'll call Heather now to the virtual stage to take over for the question and answer period. There you are, Heather. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cody. That was great. We do have we have a few questions. We have 2 questions right now posted in the chat. So if anyone else who was watching or anyone on the call has any questions for Cody, feel free to post those and I'll pass those along. So Cody, the first question that we have is they start by saying, I realize context matters, but generally speaking, I wonder if you feel Indigenous history can be represented well at existing national sites or if structures are irreparable.
So I'm going to answer that partially by saying, make sure you buy the book of my thesis that'll come out in a few years, because I try to answer that question in about 400 pages or so. I think it's really hard to say. I think some national historic sites are very rooted in sort of this colonial context, and the narratives associated with them are hard to change. I'm going to talk about both World Heritage and National Historic Sites. For the World Heritage Convention, you know, it's sort of this internationally regulated process. You can nominate one site a year. So Canada has this reluctance to change the outstanding universal value, because that means they can't designate another national historic or another World Heritage site that same year. That's sort of been the argument for the Canadian Rocky Mountain Parks. It's too difficult to change the outstanding universal value. We'll just change our management plans, for instance, and not sort of the internationally recognized significance. But I still think that's really flawed. It's kind of narrowing down the significance of these sites. For National Historic Sites of Canada, it is a lot easier for the Historic Sites and Monuments Board to go back and change their statement of significance, which is again the same reason, the reasons why they're designating it as as nationally significant. But I'm also going to call out the Historic Sites and Monuments Board and Parks Canada, because they've mentioned, for example, Duncan Campbell Scott. He was commemorated as a national historic person because of his contributions as a Canadian poet. That's why he was designated as nationally significant. And again, there's big pushback now, calls to get his commemoration changed to recognize the assimilationist role that he had. But again, institutions like the Historic Sites and Monuments Board and Parks Canada are saying that's difficult, because if they go back, if they open that designation again, they're never going to find an interpretation that everybody agrees with. So they say for now, they'll just leave sort of that designation as it is. And that's what's happening at some Indigenous sites as well. Notably sites that talk about the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. You know, they say there's this rhetoric that it's too difficult to go and change some of these statements of significance, so it's better just to leave them as they are for now. So I don't know if I necessarily answered that question, but I kind of went on a bit of a rant. But again, you know, I think there's yes and no, pros and cons for each.
And then same person, sort of a follow-up, I suppose, or maybe an add-on to the question is what they wonder is also particularly contrasting UNESCO sites and those managed by Parks Canada. So I don't know how well I'm representing that question, but I think, you know, perhaps do you see differences in the ways that Indigenous history can be represented or worked with within those 2 different structures?
Yeah. So does this person have a name? Do we know?
Aaron.
Aaron. Okay. So the question, so it's interesting because again, Canada has 21 UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Not all of them are Parks Canada, but most of them are. And again, there's definitely huge differences in that. UNESCO is such a firmly kind of relegated process. Parks Canada as an agency, I have seen some good change happening there, especially they have, gosh, I forget the formal title. Indigenous monitored national parks and sites. There's also great advocacy by groups like the Indigenous Guardians Program. Parks Canada has established an Indigenous Advisory Council as well, which is doing some great work. And I know a lot of people involved in that. So I think as an organization stewarding their natural portfolio, there has been various important, significant changes respecting treaty rights. Some, still a lot of work to do. But again, when you start adding this UNESCO umbrella on top of it, and UNESCO has sort of cyclical monitoring. Every 5 years, they come around and monitor a site to assure the outstanding universal value is met. So when you have that different framework on top, that's when things start getting difficult. And again, our Canadian national parks don't sort of have this firmly stated objective or goal or mission statement, whereas UNESCO World Heritage Sites do have the specific reasons why it's deemed internationally significant. And that creates this checkbox, which again can include or exclude Indigenous peoples so significantly.
So another question here too, and in a sense, it sort of touches on what you just talked about. It's again from Aaron. I imagine you touch on this in your book. But the question is, I wonder about goals for preserving natural landscapes versus continuing to allow for traditional land use, and whether some institutions are better about handling this relationship than others.
So, I mean, yes and no. That wasn't a yes or no question, but I'm going to answer yes or no. One thing that I think about, my research right now is very much geared to the work of the Historic Sites and Monuments Board, who have sort of, even though they're under this umbrella of Parks Canada, which is currently the agency that oversees their work, the Historic Sites and Monuments Board has sort of explicitly not commemorated natural areas as being nationally significant, unless they do sort of include these cultural values. So again, cultural landscapes, we're starting to see them more. There's also things like the Rideau Canal as a national historic site. Again, it's sort of natural and cultural values combined. It's also a World Heritage Site. But again, I think kind of moving away from these commemorative designations to just the stewardship of traditional territories. I think more and more agencies like the Indigenous Guardians Program, which has significant federal funding now, is sort of going to be the change that needs to happen, is where Indigenous youth and elders are working together on the land to assure that those holistic and sustainable relationships are actually being advanced in a way that does have this stable core funding going into the future. So I think that sort of, it might still work within the framework of kind of established national parks and kind of federally preserved ecological areas, but at the same time, there are now systems in place to assure that those relationships are funded.
Thanks, Cody. So we have a few questions that are popping in now, and some of them may sort of build on things that you've already said.
Right.
But just before I get to the next question, there's a comment here from Lisa, and she says, "Don't apologize for criticizing Parks Canada. There are many of us who agree with you and feel that there are still changes that need to happen." So that was one comment, and then a question from comment and then question from Lauren. She's a cultural heritage interpreter working in Southern Ontario on EA projects. Recently in conversation with Indigenous groups about how to address the UNDRIP Act in their work. What can I do as a settler to facilitate the protection and recognition of Indigenous landscapes, given that I don't have the cultural understanding and context to even recognize these landscapes?
So I think that's really interesting. And I'm so glad that that question came about, because in my capacity with the Indigenous Heritage Circle, national not-for-profit, we have actually received funds from Parks Canada to do a research project on UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and how Indigenous nations, heritage practitioners, communities might envision using UNDRIP to advance their work. And what we've seen so far, it's still a work in progress. We have two great a research team of two individuals working on this, is that some communities haven't even thought about it yet. I mean, what I say a lot of time is some Indigenous nations are focused on clean drinking water and equitable access to housing and internet. They haven't been able to allocate the resources for heritage preservation. So some have not kind of applied UNDRIP yet in that capacity, which is fine and important. Also, I know some Indigenous nations in the Yukon, for instance, have noted how they have treaty rights that are firmly entrenched, heritage treaty rights, and those take more significance than UNDRIP. Those are actually, legally preserved, recognized by, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So UNDRIP is, something that's actually viewed as lesser for them for advancing those goals. So we're doing kind of a case study report, which is going to be published by the Indigenous Heritage Circle later this year to kind of problematize and see what other nations are doing. So I don't really have a takeaway for that yet. But, I do really think that, I'm trying to word this the right way. I'm also teaching cultural landscapes in my class next week, looking at Southwestern Ontario, and they've sort of already started being preserved or recognized as cultural landscapes. But again, for like agricultural significance, this is such an agricultural capital, Southwestern Ontario. And again, while some of that might be worth preserving and the cultural values associated with it, it's preserving these narratives of sort of colonialism as well. So it's very hard to do that. And, there's such significant displacement in Southwestern Ontario. So again, I don't necessarily know the answer to that question. I think it's definitely going to be a work in progress. I think I might just leave it there, Heather.
Perfect. So we have another question. It's interesting because some of the questions that we're getting, a lot of the questions that we're getting are touching on the nature culture idea, which I suppose is not, it's not surprising for an environmental history crowd. But Elizabeth, thanks you for your talk and asks, I'm curious about how to holistically manage these incredible places when government bureaucracy separates natural and cultural resources from each other. Have you encountered instances of strong caretaking in practice that accounts for the importance of things like animals, plants, land, water, and other, quote, natural things that are so critical to culture?
I really do think that from what I've seen, Pomochanaq Key, the World Heritage Site on the Ontario-Manitoba border, very much driven by the Indigenous nations, there is a good example of sort of recognizing, first of all, not differentiating humans and realizing that the Anishinaabe are holistically part of that landscape and vital to its stewardship and caring. And I just always, celebrate and praise organizations like First Peoples Cultural Council in British Columbia, Provincial Crown Corporation, very much governed by Indigenous nations. Their heritage manager, Karen Aird, was the founder of the Indigenous Heritage Circle, which I had the honor of being the president of. And she's done significant work, in my opinion, in British Columbia to assure that some of the stewardship of landscapes there do recognize that holistic relationship. I mean, I've just had such the amazing opportunity over the past 3 years when I've really kind of deep dived into Indigenous heritage to work with some amazing heritage practitioners across the country who are working on this. I think of Tim Bernard in Nova Scotia, who's the Director of History and Culture for the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq. Keisha Supernaut, who's an archaeologist, Métis archaeologist, who's working on unearthing and reclaiming children who were buried at residential schools. All of these people are sort of doing this very important work in Indigenous cultural heritage, which I value and I uphold so much. But it is hard because that bureaucracy is in place. And one thing that I've seen so much is they might not necessarily have these sites yet that they fully are able to steward, but they are working side by side with their nations to assure that their values and their beliefs and their rights are being upheld. So I'm not able to provide specific site case studies offhand, but I just know that there's a lot of people across the country who are doing work that I admire significantly.
Thanks, Cody. So this question is from Sean. National parks in Canada have a troubled history with Indigenous people and their land and treaty rights. Do you see a tension between that history and the current role that heritage designations play in recognizing Indigenous rights?
I have such a hard time answering this question because I think, for example, well, I've been to example for ministers roundtables for Parks Canada, and there's discussion of cultural heritage legislation. Problems with that is that cultural heritage legislation in Canada, which is still being debated and discussed, and it's something I'm critical of, is so focused still on built infrastructure. And Canada has this significant portfolio of national historic sites. Parks Canada stewards, I believe, about 110 national historic sites. And some of them, for example, in Aurelia, the Majenkening Fish Weirs, which is a site that I find very significant. It's been used for thousands of years. But the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada recognizes this site as being significant because of the relationship between people and the waterway and the fish and that sustainable relationship. So that's a site that Parks Canada stewards. It's a site that has a federal management plan. But if there was cultural heritage legislation in Canada, it would do nothing because there's such a focus on built infrastructure. Even though the Government of Canada, the Historic Sites and Monuments Board, has recognized the significance of this site, the national significance of this site being the relationship between the people and the water. Legislation wouldn't deal with that. It wouldn't try to address that and solve that. So I think the legislation that Parks Canada is even now trying to develop is weak before it's even introduced. But again, that's that difference between the jurisdictions of these organizations, the cultural and natural values. A really interesting example is in Nova Scotia, and I am blanking on the name of the national park off the top of my head. Maybe Heather can help me get there, but it's both
is it Kejimkujik maybe?
It is, yes, it is. Thank you very much, Kejimkujik. It's a national park and a national historic site. It's the only example in the country that has both designations overlapping itself. But again, the values that are kind of preserved through those two designations are still sort of seen as two different things. The cultural values and the natural values are kind of differentiated. They have related and associated plans to steward them. But again, it's these two very different designations that overlap each other. And if you look at almost any national park in Canada, well, not almost, every single national park in Canada has these deep Indigenous holistic relationships to them, but they're, again, not necessarily respected, celebrated, upheld in the same ways. So again, I often ramble when I answer questions and don't necessarily give a good answer, but I'll pass it back to Heather.
I think that happens to all of us. I think it's still a good answer, but and you get, there's so much, right? And especially with questions like these are such big questions. So this is a comment and question from Nancy. Interesting presentation. What a cliffhanger of a conclusion. And the question is, what legal implications to environmental history do you envision?
So I think it's just sort of those examples. I'm just going to kind of minimize my screen so I can look at what I have. So if there's legal implications, what I mean is, you know, things like treaty rights in Yukon acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have the right to uphold their heritage values. If the Yukon Ice Patches are deemed nationally and internationally significant for that heritage relationship, the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the ice patches, for instance. If the ice patches are damaged because of climate crisis, because of government actions, again, all of that, we can track the history of the ice patches. It might be considered environmental history for some people. And again, we see very deeply the environmental history, how these are shrinking. And again, that is damaging our relationship with these ice patches. That's damaging our legal right regarding heritage. That's sort of a rambly explanation. But again, I think it's all of those connections. If we see so firmly that Indigenous peoples have a right to articulate, to uphold, to strengthen our cultural heritage. If our cultural heritage is so deeply tied in legislation or upheld through legislation, if our relationship to our environment is deemed through this heritage legislation as being nationally or internationally significant, if that environmental history, if those environmental sites are damaged because of government actions, including failing to uphold the climate crisis. That's kind of the interrelationship I see between environmental history, legal implications, sort of tied to those cultural values and upholding them. Heather.
I think this sort of leads actually really well into the next question from Julie. Are you worried about the increase in chatter from politicians about mitigation to address climate change?
I think I know who, I'm guessing I know which Julie is asking this question. I think it's, I still think, so it's hard because the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada is currently overseen by Parks Canada. Parks Canada is within the umbrella of the Ministry of the Environment and Climate Change. So Canada's biggest cultural heritage organization body, the one responsible for designating National Historic Sites of Canada, is under the administration of the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. But even with that being the current political system, I really feel like the Ministry of the Environment and Climate Change, from the ministerial perspective, doesn't recognize its role in upholding cultural heritage values and noting that relationship between culture and the natural environment. From the ministerial perspective, there's still sort of that divide that's missing. And I feel like a lot of ministers in that portfolio for many years have failed to kind of recognize that relationship to things. And when the ministerial level does acknowledge, the role of the Historic Sites and Monuments Board, it gets very much essentialized to those cultural sites, not necessarily that deep relationship between nature and culture. So again, I feel like organizationally, organizations like Parks Canada are starting to do some important work in that direction. But when it comes to the minister, when it comes to the deputy minister, I feel there's still not necessarily that acknowledgement that their ministry has a role culturally to address climate change as well.
Thanks, Cody. So there's one question still here. If anyone else in the audience there has another question, we can just take a few more. And if nothing else comes in, then we'll, I guess, sort of leave it on this question. But so the question is, can you comment regarding the cultural heritage features of the area occupied by Long Point Provincial Park on the northwest shore of Lake Erie near Port Rowan, Ontario? So it's a pretty specific question, and it's possible that you may not be able to respond.
No, I can't, but I will use that as an example. I'm going to talk about the other side of sort of the southwestern Ontario Peninsula on the shores of Lake Huron. I think, for example, and this goes back to that cultural landscape southwestern Ontario question from a few ago as well. There's a National Historic Site of Canada there, Park Hill. It is in the town of Park Hill, Ontario. It is a Indigenous Paleolithic former village from, I think, dated to about 10,000, 11,000 years ago. And that's so significant to me because, it's viewed as an archaeological site to many people. But what that tells me is, this is a site where Indigenous peoples hunted caribou, they hunted mastodon, they had a quarry there, they had a mine there. It's in southwestern Ontario. It's about 50 minutes from London, 40 minutes from London. So what that tells me is that's proof that the federal government has recognized through this designation of National Historic Site that Indigenous peoples have had a deeply significant relationship to the natural environment in southwestern Ontario for 10,000, 11,000 years. It's clearly recognized. But again, that's not sort of, when we get to kind of this, we just skip to sort of like the 16, 17, 1800s, and they start saying that there's no Indigenous relationship to this territory because there was so much displacement amongst Indigenous peoples. I think that is completely phony, that interpretation, but it exists in sort of these heritage discourses, which is again how we get this agricultural significance celebrated and upheld, even though it's only about 200 years old, if that. But again, this sort of Indigenous relationship, which we recognize as being 11,000 years old, is erased because there's not sort of in this federal mindset, this continuum of significance for that entire period of time. But I mean, we're still here in southwestern Ontario as Indigenous peoples. So again, that relationship is upheld. It's recognized as significant through a National Historic Site designation. But yeah, so that's not Port Rowan, that's the other side. But I think you have to take that long look at it. You have to realize it's not just a specific period. Southwestern Ontario as a whole has been lived and occupied and deemed significant for so long.
Thanks, Cody. So this isn't really a question, like a content sort of question, but just a few folks had asked if they were, if you would be okay with them getting in touch. They're interested in your work and in the UNDRIP, the report on UNDRIP and Indigenous heritage. So I won't necessarily have you give your personal information on the Zoom, but you're not hard to find if you're okay with people
Yes,
reaching out to you?
definitely. I work at Western University. I have a faculty profile there on the History and Indigenous Studies page. My work email is there, and I can be contacted at any time for any reason.
Perfect. So I think we have a comment here that's excellent lecture. Dave Neufeld would have really enjoyed this. And I think that that's absolutely true and probably a really good way for us to wrap up. So of course, thanks so much, Cody, for giving us this talk. It was a great way to start off a Friday. And of course, thanks to the audience. Thanks to everybody who came and listened to Cody, and especially for those who asked questions. And I think we'll wrap it up and hopefully see in a virtual, invisible sense, some of you next year at the Neufeld Memorial Lecture. So thanks again, Cody.
Bye, everyone.
Okay, and the stream is over.
Nice.
That was great. Excellent work.